next second cup is in 2 weeks, which is the 20th, I think. But in 2 Thursdays with a local author, Robert Dunkerley. He's going to talk about women of the revolution and the truth about camp followers. So that might be a very interesting, that will be a very interesting second cup conversation. So I hope you'll all be able to join us. I will introduce Kate and then let her take it over. Since 2012, Kate Hesseldenz has been the curator at Liberty Hall Historic Site in Frankfort, Kentucky. She has over 20 years of museum experience in collections management, exhibit development, and education. Kentucky history and archival research are two of Kate's interests, and she is knowledgeable about both Kentucky's prehistoric and historical past. She holds a BA in art history and anthropology from Indiana University and an MA in anthropology and museum studies from the University of Denver. Kate has held positions at the University of Kentucky's Webb Museum of Anthropology, the Denver Art Museum, the Kentucky Historical Society, and the University of Kentucky's Special Collections Research Center. So Kate, welcome.
Thank you. So let's see here. I will share my screen. Let's see here. And let me get this into slideshow. Okay, so yeah, thank you, Tina, and thank you to the Powder Magazine for having me and for everyone that is tuning in. So today I'm going to talk about General Lafayette's visit to Liberty Hall in 1825. But first, I'm going to introduce you to Liberty Hall Historic Site and the Brown family. So we are owned and operated by the National Society of Colonial Dames of America and the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And we are the only property in Kentucky owned by the Dames. And Liberty Hall is a Georgian style mansion that was built by John Brown. And John Brown's claim to fame is he was one of the first of Kentucky's first United States senators. And he began building the home in 1796, and it wasn't finished until 1804. So John Brown, he was from Virginia, and he came to Kentucky when it was still part of Virginia. He was trained as a lawyer, and he settled firstly in Danville, Kentucky in 1783, which was the seat of government at that point. And Margaretta, his wife, Margaretta Mason, was born in 1772, and she actually grew up in New York City and had quite the culture shock when she moved to Kentucky in 1801. So John Brown, they married in 1799, and he was 41 and she was 26, so there was quite an age difference there. And we sit on 4 acres of land, and we're bound by the Kentucky River on the western side of our property. So we have kind of informal and formal gardens. We are located in downtown Frankfort, which is the state's capital. So John Brown built a very grand home, and these are a few shots of the front of the house. These are formal rooms, the parlor there and the dining room. And we went through a restoration project about 8 to 10 years ago where we did a lot of research and kind of reinterpreted these rooms. And the wallpaper you see on the walls and the carpet are reproduction to the period. But they're grand rooms, and they're like 13 feet ceilings. So they're really, really nice. But in contrast to that, the back side of the house, we've also been working on some of those rooms. And this is the Liberty Hall kitchen, which we did an exhibit in just a couple of years ago. And we're trying to interpret slavery more in this room. And so it's got panels and some cases and interactive units. It's also a room setting, as you can see. And just below that is the laundry room, which we also, it's kind of a subterranean room that we just, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, are using that as an interpretive space too. So the Browns, let's see, the Browns did own slaves, and they enslaved at least 15 people who lived at Liberty Hall. This is during the time of John. And among them were the Stepney family. So Hannah and Miles Stepney were the parents, and there were 8 children. And then there were a few other individuals that we don't have their last name. 2 Fannies, a Frankie, a Harriet, and a Henry that also worked at Liberty Hall, lived and worked at Liberty Hall. So we're really trying to make an effort, not just to talk about their stories in those workspaces in the back of the house, but throughout the whole house. And, you know, those opulent rooms I showed you before really are made possible because of the work of the enslaved people at Liberty Hall. So we also have another house on the property, the Orlando Brown house. So there were 2 sons that lived to adulthood. That they actually had 5 children, but Mason Brown and Orlando were the only ones that survived. So Mason Brown, the eldest one here, he inherited Liberty Hall after his parents died. And then John Brown built the second home, the Orlando Brown house, in 1835 for Orlando, who inhabited that house with his wife, Mary Watts. And this house, we don't really use this as a museum as much, although it does have a lot of original furnishings in it and paintings. But we have lectures in there and other functions. And then upstairs is our offices, which are very nice offices. They're very big. And by the way, so Mason, he ended up being a lawyer and a judge. And then Orlando, he had a tough time choosing it. He had a lot of different things he dabbled in, medicine and lawyer. He was a lawyer for a while, but he ended up being the editor of the Frankfort Commonwealth, which was a local newspaper. And then John Brown, just to give you a little of his political career, he went to school at Princeton and then William and Mary, and he studied there with George Wythe. He also studied with or read law with Thomas Jefferson, and those 2 were friends throughout their life. But right when he came to Kentucky, which was then considered the West, and I have this map here to just show you, this is an atlas from our collection, just to show you how Kentucky really is that on the edge of the country there in 1804 when that map was drawn. But he begins with representing Kentucky, the District of Kentucky in the Virginia legislature, and then moves on to the House of Representatives. And then we became a state in 1792. So the newly formed Kentucky legislature elected him as one of their first senators. And he served for 3 terms until 1805. And this is kind of a little aside, but this state seal here, this was the first state seal from 1793. John Brown actually was on the committee to help create that seal. But you see these 2 men are embracing. It's united we stand, divided we fall. That's the Kentucky slogan. Our current state seal shows a frontiersman and a statesman just shaking hands. But this last one was made recently and is a nod to the pandemic, and it's pretty funny. Yeah, I think it's hilarious. So it's united we stand, 6 feet apart. So yeah, so hopefully we can get back to embracing at some point. So a little bit about Margaretta. She's a pretty interesting person, Margaretta Brown. She was very highly educated and well-read. And one thing she did in 1819, she was the first superintendent of a Presbyterian Sunday school for girls. And she served as its treasurer, and she was a teacher. She and John were both very religious. Their fathers were both Presbyterian ministers. So this slide here, this is a little book she wrote. It's called Food for Lambs. It's really actually not wrote. She really compiled it. It's just kind of a religious dictionary. And then this thing in the middle here is a commonplace book she kept. It's called Fugitive Pieces or Juvenile Essays, and her main name is Mason. She began this when she was 13. So she wrote poetry, but she also copied down other poems that she admired in this little really cool book that we have in the collection. And then she was also an avid letter writer. She wrote a lot of letters. This is one to Orlando. I think those 2 both shared the love of writing, and this is a letter she wrote him a lot. They were frequent correspondence. So then the last people to live in Liberty Hall, the woman in the white dress here on the left is Mary Mason Scott. This is her mother. They're in the Liberty Hall garden there. She died in 1934, and then Liberty Hall became a museum in 37. And then this woman here, Anne Horde Brown, was the last person to live in the Orlando Brown house, and she died in 55, and then it was left to the dames at that point. So let's see here. So that's a little bit about Liberty Hall, just to give you a background. But now I'm going to talk about Lafayette's visit. So he visited on May 14th, 1825, during his farewell tour of the nation. And he did visit South Carolina on this tour in March of 1825. So while in Frankfort, he made only 4 stops. And I had just wondered why he did that. Why did he go to Liberty Hall? What was the connection between Lafayette and the Browns? So that's kind of why I got this talk together. But first, let's just give a little introduction about Lafayette and the American Revolution. So he was a French nobleman, and you can see there he has a very long last name. I think more often he goes by the Marquis de Lafayette or just Lafayette. He was born in 1757, which is the same year as John Brown, actually, into a very wealthy family. And at the time of the Revolutionary War, the American cause was very popular in France. And this, by the way, is where he grew up, this Chavanac. It looks like a castle. So when he was 19, Lafayette decided that he wanted to follow in the footsteps of his ancestors, which many of them were who had served in the military, and seek glory in war. So the American Revolution really fit the bill. He was inspired by Enlightenment thinkers, and he was very impressed with the Declaration of Independence, which draws heavily from Enlightenment ideals. He also hated the British, due largely to the French involvement in the 7 Years' War. It's a conflict between Great Britain and France during the mid-18th century, when the British took control of French colonies in North America. So all these factors really came together for Lafayette, and he purchased a boat, which he named La Victoire, to cross the Atlantic, and he self-funded his trip to America. So, and as many of you know, there probably in South Carolina, he arrived on June 13th, 1777, after 56 days at sea. And he landed on the North Island near Georgetown, South Carolina. His intended landing place was Charleston, but adverse weather landed him north of his destination. And I think there was about 45 Frenchmen that accompanied him, and they actually walked to Charleston. And he wrote to his wife, Adrienne, that Charleston was one of the most attractive, best built, and most pleasantly populated cities I have ever seen. So prior to leaving France, Lafayette asked for and was given the rank of Major General by the American diplomat Silas Deane. And he agreed to be not paid for his services. And that's going to kind of come up later in this talk. So while in America, Lafayette really proved himself as a skilled military officer, and he earned the respect of George Washington. And George Washington really became a father figure to Lafayette. Lafayette had lost his father when he was only 2. His father actually died in a battle against the British in the 7 Years' War. This is another reason he probably disliked Britain. And Washington did not have any biological children of his own. So the two really formed a strong friendship, and they had kind of a father-son relationship. And of course, Lafayette commanded American troops at several battles, including the siege of Yorktown. So skipping ahead to 1824, Lafayette became the nation's guest when President Monroe and the US Congress invited him to visit America. He was the last surviving Major General of the Revolutionary War, and at that point, they were going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the war in 1825. So that was why he came. So Lafayette's visit to Liberty Hall was one of many, many, many stops he made on this tour. He visited all 24 states of the Union in 13 months, from August 1824 to September 1825. So he was entertained at balls and banquets, praised in speeches, songs, and poems, and escorted through towns by military guards. And this is in Philadelphia from a newspaper article from 1824. So immediately prior to visiting Frankfort, Lafayette had been in Louisville, Kentucky, and then he comes to Frankfort. He also then goes to Lexington, Kentucky, and then goes towards Cincinnati. So that was kind of the route. So here we are with the Frankfort stop. So the first stop is this public green. This is the site of the old state capitol in Frankfort. At that time, there was no capitol there, it had burned down. So really it was a public green at that point. Here's Liberty Hall. He also visited the home of Lucy Payne Washington. This is Dolly Madison's sister. So this house is still standing there on Wapping Street, the Todd home. And then there's a tavern that just down the road there. And this is, they were going to have a ball in Lafayette's honor. And he stayed overnight at this place too. And according to the Argus of Western America, this is a Frankfort newspaper, the ballroom at Weisiger Tavern was one of the largest rooms for a ball in the Western country, with a splendid area for dancing. So the reason we know that Lafayette visited Liberty Hall was from a letter that Margaretta Brown wrote to her stepmother, Sarah Van Alston Mason, in July 12th of 1825, where she describes the visit. Let's see here. In the letter, she wrote that a splendid ball was to be given in the evening, and pictured here is the invitation to the ball that was held at that tavern. So Margaretta wrote that she was first introduced to Lafayette at his marquee because there were many ladies who did not attend balls and yet wished to see the general, and I was one of that number. Margaretta is referring to the outdoor reception that was held on the public square green earlier in the day. She writes that she had such a hearty and long continued shake of the hand as to occasion the envy of many an impatient expectant. So Auguste Levasseur, who accompanied Lafayette on the grand tour as his secretary, also describes this reception. He wrote in a published travelogue of the trip in 1829 that before the dinner, they passed several hours in receiving visits and marks of friendship from the whole population, which at that time was about 1,800 people in Frankfort in 1825. So the general then went to dinner that had been prepared for him on the public square. There was about 800 people there, including militia that escorted him from Louisville and officers from Kentucky and Tennessee who had distinguished themselves in war. So after meeting Lafayette at the public reception, Margaretta went home, and she writes that 12 or 14 of her friends took tea with her and urged her to go to the ball. But since she had not frequented any place of public amusement for many years, she refused the invitation. And that's because she was a religious person. She refused to go. So Margaretta writes that they all paraded off to the ball except Elizabeth Humphreys and myself. And Elizabeth Humphreys was her niece. Then she says that her friends had not been gone more than 20 minutes when who should arrive but General Lafayette, his son and suite, that's Levasseur. Margaretta wrote that the general spent nearly an hour with us in the most delightful conversation, while those who went to the ball did not exchange a syllable with him. And then she says, had I not a triumph? And this is, she's definitely delighting here in one-upmanship over those friends that went to the ball. That's very much her personality. Her letters are pretty interesting. So from Margaretta's letter, I infer this was a very unexpected visit. She did not mention John Brown, her husband, being part of the conversation, although we don't know, he could have been there. It really does seem like Lafayette came to see Margaretta after meeting her at the reception. So why did he visit her? So I believe that Lafayette's visit was a result of Lafayette's relationship with James Brown. This is John Brown's brother, who at the time was the ambassador to France. He was in that position from 1823 to 1829. So a little background on him. He was the younger brother of John Brown, also trained as a lawyer. He was the first Secretary of State from Kentucky, but he moved to New Orleans in 1804, and he had a very highly profitable sugar plantation there. He was then secretary and attorney for the territory of Orleans, and then also was a United States Senator from Louisiana. He served 2 different terms. Another thing about him was he has a famous brother-in-law. He was a famous brother-in-law to a famous Kentuckian, which is Henry Clay. He married a woman named Anne Nancy Hart, and whose sister was Clay's wife, Lucretia Hart. So as Minister to France, Brown delivered the letter to Lafayette from President Monroe, informing him that by congressional resolution, he had been invited to visit the United States. And Lafayette received the letter in February of 1824. Monroe stated that Congress has passed a resolution in which the sincere attachment of the whole nation to you is expressed, whose ardent desire is once more to see you amongst them, and that Lafayette should come to his adopted country of his early youth, which has always preserved the most grateful recollection of your important services. So another interesting part of Margaretta's letter discusses how after visiting Frankfort, Lafayette went to Lexington. And she relates that the Browns' eldest son, Mason was introduced to the general in Lexington. Lafayette told Mason that he was indebted to his family for all the honor and pleasure he had received since his arrival in America, for that if his uncle James, our minister of the court of France, had not become security for his return, he would never have been permitted to leave France. So what does this mean exactly? So at this time, there was a good deal of tension between the conservative King Louis XVIII and Lafayette. He had returned to France from the American Revolution as a hero, but by 1823, Lafayette, who's now about 66 years old, was at the end of his political career in France. So Lafayette, while he believed there should be a king, he believed in a constitutional monarchy. He also believed in freedom of the press, personal liberty, and the right to vote for all, which this king did not support. In letters to Monroe, in the months leading up to the voyage, James Brown states that Lafayette has financial troubles, and he calls upon Brown frequently in Paris. And in a letter from May 30th, 1824, Brown writes, "General Lafayette calls upon me almost every day. Although offered a free ride to America via a U.S. frigate, Lafayette declined, feeling it was an imposition and undemocratic. Instead, Lafayette raised money for his voyage, and his friends pooled their money so he could buy passage on a ship. Brown states that Lafayette is working to raise the money at any sacrifice." And the phrase in Margaretta's letter, "not permitted to leave France," has been assumed to mean that the king wouldn't allow it. But in this context, I believe it means that he didn't have the means financially to leave France. In fact, in a letter to Monroe from Brown, he actually uses that phrase. He writes of Lafayette's financial affairs, saying they were not such as would permit him to leave France. So once rich, Lafayette now is broke. He had lost money and land during the French Revolution, and he also is said to have lived beyond his means. So his financial situation did not permit him to leave. He eventually left France on the American merchant vessel Cadmus on July 13th, 1824. So Margaretta's letter implies that James Brown was security, and it has been assumed that Brown was held hostage until Lafayette returned. And that comes from some old tours and probably misunderstanding of this letter. As I have not found there's nothing to support that notion that Brown was a hostage of the French court until Lafayette's return. Now, he did have tension with that king, but he was definitely free to leave the country. And I believe Brown helped to secure money for Lafayette for his Revolutionary War service. And Brown writes of this in letters to Monroe, that this payback would help offset the expenses of the voyage. So we don't actually have the original of this letter, it's missing, but we have a transcript. I think it might have been mistranscribed. Perhaps instead of James Brown becoming security, it was more likely that he arranged the security or the guarantee of a repayment of a loan. Brown likely helped to facilitate a repayment because before Lafayette left America, Congress awarded him $200,000 in government bonds and a grant of land in Florida, so repaying him for his service in the war. and he probably counted on this money for his return trip. But he was so well received in America during this tour that he then did decide to take a free ride on the USS Brandywine back to France. And they commissioned that ship after the first battle that he was in, which he was wounded at. I think that was the only time he was wounded in the war. He was shot in the leg. So it does make sense that Lafayette would have been very thankful for Brown's role in making this trip happen and helping Lafayette acquire money and land for his service to America. He would be indebted to the Brown family for their assistance. So this tour ultimately enabled Lafayette to regain some political prestige in France. And as he was in financial trouble, the trip also certainly helped him financially. So that's the end. And if you want to go ahead and do the questions, I will take my screen down.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Does anybody have any questions or comments they'd like to type into the chat right away? Okay. I have a couple of kind of small questions.
Yeah.
Just from a little bit of reading that I've done, and this may be from reading on old websites and may not be true or not. Is it true that Liberty Hall still has a teacup that was used when he came to see Mrs. Brown?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I did this talk about a year ago at a historic house in Louisville, and I talked about that myth. But yeah, it's not true. It's a myth. The cup is really from 1844, so it dates later than the visit. But yes, that has perpetuated. And even when I gave tours, I don't give tours that much anymore, but I remember people saying, "Where's the cup?" You know, it used to be on display in the dining room. So, but yeah, it's hard to ascribe a cup, an object, to something like that, an event like that. But yeah, we do still have it.
Okay,
but it's not on display.
It's not his. Another question was, what happened to the land in Florida that Lafayette was granted?
He didn't keep it. I believe that he sold that land. He never did anything with it. So, okay. Yeah.
And then this kind of goes back to the history of the house and the involvement of the colonial dames. Was Anne Brown a dame?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Anne Hort Brown, and also Mary Mason Scott, the one, they were like second cousins or something, the one that lived in the other house. They were both dames.
Okay. And y'all are back open, is that right? Yes,
we opened July 6th, and we're having limited tours. It's about 6 people, and they can do it online, sign up for the tour. But yeah, we have 2 tours, 11:30 and 1:30, Monday through Saturday.
Okay. I had a question about architecture. In some of the reading that I was doing, and it may be the Orlando Brown house, but that may be attributed to William Strickland or to a student of William Strickland who designed houses here in Charleston. And I can't bring any to the top of my head, so anybody who's on Zoom and knows that, help me out here. But it just interests me, the Virginia connection and the architecture's traveling west along with, you know, with the ideas and everything. So do you know anything about the architecture? I've also read the name Owen Biddle of Philadelphia, and the Biddles, of course, were.
Are you talking about the Liberty Hall?
Well, I think it's either Liberty Hall or Orlando Brown house that may have been the Strickland house, and then Liberty Hall was the Biddle.
Okay, so we know for sure that Orlando Brown house was Gideon Schrock, which was a Kentucky architect. And I'm not sure who he was trained by. There's a book coming out soon about that. All of his architecture, houses and other public places. But yeah, the William Strickland, maybe he did train under him, I'm not sure. The Liberty Hall house, we really don't know. I just recently read somebody that attributed to Owen Biddle, but I've always thought we didn't know who designed it. So that it looks a lot like Virginia houses. There were some people from Colonial Williamsburg that visited, gosh, a couple years back. And if anybody's seen the George Wythe house, which, you know, John Brown would have been probably at that house in Williamsburg, it's supposed to very much resemble that house. So it's definitely got Virginia. It looks like a Virginia house.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh.
Another question. Do you know whether the NSCDA Kentucky or the Dames in South Carolina plan to support the Lafayette Trail project in preparation for the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's visit? Will any of the societies install historic markers? And there's a little bit of history of it here. This project is a nationwide effort managed by Julian Isher. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, and supported by the Friends of Lafayette Society. So you sound familiar with it.
Well, yeah, I think, yeah, the Lafayette Trail, it's actually, I had a part of it in that talk, where I showed the map. Yeah, it's a French citizen. He lives in America, but he's going through, and the website's really great. It's called the Lafayette Trail. But I don't know if he's been to South Carolina or is following. I'm sure
there were some articles published last year about places he had visited here in Charleston that we were, some we hadn't heard about, so we were trying to track some of that down too. So I know there's stuff going on here in Charleston. Next question, was the heroic John Brown of Harper's Ferry related to Senator John Brown? Is there any relation?
I knew someone would ask that. No, he's not. He's
okay.
not. There's also like Browns in Kentucky is not related to either. He's not related to any of those famous Browns.
Having come from Virginia too, there'd probably be more. And from this, also, how come Lafayette's standing from the revolution sustained? Well, his standing was sustained from the Revolutionary War, his reputation and prestige. So he was still a hero when he came. And I also believe he had spent a good bit of time in prison in the most radical stages of the French Revolution, because I remember reading about efforts here trying to get him out.
They're Americans. Yeah, you're right. The French Revolution is, I believe, because he still supported the king. I mean, he had a lot of, like the freedom. He believed, he was democratic, but he did believe in the king. So I think he kind of went sideways with the revolutionary people. And I know and then it was in Austria, wasn't it, that he ended up in the prison?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, and so, he was, up until 1823, he was in the parliament. He was in the Chamber of Duties. And then as I think there was, with this conservative king, he just kind of fell out of favor. But and his wife, Adrienne, she died much before him, I think like in 1807. And I think it was attributed to being in the prison because the whole family was in the prison.
Right.
So, but I don't know too much about the French Revolution, but interesting life.
Okay. And I have a notice from Teresa S. who says, we enjoyed this as part of our school today in Tennessee. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. So this is another, this is not really historic, but it's sometimes kind of fun to think of these. The story of the Gray Lady at Liberty Hall website. I don't know if you want to share that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the Gray Lady, yes, that's probably one of our most famous, especially in the town of Frankfort. Everyone loves the Gray Lady. So it's a ghost story. And so in 1817, Margaretta Brown's, her aunt, which was also named Margaretta Varick from New York, was visiting, and she died probably of natural causes of a heart attack. She hadn't been there long. And so that happened like in 1817 or 1818, I think. I can't remember the exact date. And then years passed, and in 1880, now you saw the picture of the last woman to live at Liberty Hall, Mary Mason Scott. She had come home from boarding school and was awoken to a gray, figure, and that went through her room, and which was on the second floor, and this happened for 3 nights, consecutive nights. And then, oops, he's showing something. So anyway, so this is how it started. And somebody said, oh, that's the old gray lady, Margaret of Erich. And then there's subsequent stories of other people staying at the house, especially in this bedroom, and seeing the gray lady. But she was supposed to be a kindly ghost. There's a famous picture, I think we probably have, that was taken in the 60s of a ghostly figure coming down the stairs. And also, but what I think is really neat about it is that Mary Mason Scott, the last person to live there, she was into spiritualism and seances, and but she really believed in the ghost, and she called her our beloved ghost. So it has a kind of a historic, you know, it's standing. It's not just made up. She really believed in it. So that's the story. And we try to have in October we'll do things around the ghost just because people enjoy it. And a lot of people, oh, there's our house. Yeah, a lot of people say they see the gray lady in our Palladian window. Whoop. That he just had on there so they see her standing there watching over the town.
So here is another question from a guest. What was the cause of the wife's death, and was it unusual for an older husband to outlive his much younger wife?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think that John Brown lived a long time. He was in his 80s. So she died in her 60s. And we think it was, she might have had an aneurysm. It could have been a stroke. We have really great documentation of her death. There's a few people that wrote about it and letters. And she had come in from a walk, and she said she felt like she had a spike in her head. And so it could have been an aneurysm. So she died pretty quickly after that. So, and yeah, I think it is unusual. I think John Brown, I think he just died of natural causes, but he did live a long time, a long life. See another question?
Yeah, I just thought, oh, this is about interpreting the site. Do you interpret the site as a snapshot in a particular time? Or are you putting the family in it? Or are you able to use artifacts that you have to really tie the family in? So just maybe address that a little bit.
Yeah, with Liberty, we pretty much right now too, especially with the pandemic, we only have Liberty Hall open for guests, and so we actually are very fortunate at Liberty Hall to have a lot of the original furnishings and of the families, and so we have a really great collection. So the first floor of Liberty Hall is the first generation. So Margaret and John and their kids. That's how we interpreted it. And then upstairs, we actually have Mary Mason Scott's room. You can tell the ghost story there. And then there's an exhibit up there and a library. We have a lot of family books and other books. So that's another room that people can see when they come on the tour. But mostly it's interpreted to that first generation.
Okay. Yeah, y'all are, you have the colonial Dames in Kentucky have a really nice direct line of inheritance directly from the family, which is amazing because so many of these houses have passed down or were slated to be demolished to make gas stations. So
yeah, that's I think we're very unique in that way. And I mean, and we have, besides the artifacts, we have lots, like I said, the books, we have all these letters, we have a lot of archives, we have a really rich collection. And you're right. I mean, it turned into a museum shortly after both of them, died. It was pretty much being run by the Dames. So yeah, we were very lucky that way.
So this was a city home for the Brown family. And I guess Senator Brown, I don't know how much time he would have spent in the Capitol. I guess.
Yeah.
Washington D.C.
City. Yeah.
Do you have plantations at all?
What's that?
Plantations.
Oh no, this was very urban. He did have land. I mean, this was just an urban, which it doesn't. Frankfort's a pretty small town, so it's funny to say it's urban, but it was. He did own land up in another county, in Owen County, and he had a ton of land in Ohio, all over Kentucky, really. So he was very land, and he started selling it off, I think, at times when he needed money. But yeah, and he traveled in the beginning when they were first living at Liberty Hall. He traveled back and forth from Washington City. Washington City is what it was called then. And it actually, because he was separated from his wife, there's a great, those letters are great because we can learn so much because they're just writing back and forth because he's away. But yeah, I think it was like a 4-week trip to get to Washington.
Okay. So kind of his wealth would have come from his land ownership or speculation or whatever.
I think a lot of it came from the land. I mean, there was times though when he seems like he's very cash poor.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and I think when he first came to Kentucky, there were a lot of people were settling. You know, it was right after the war. A lot of people were coming west, and there was all these conflicting land claims in Kentucky. And so I think as a lawyer, I think he might have helped sort some of that out and ended up getting paid for it in land. I mean, so I think that's maybe one of the reasons. But yeah, we need to know. We don't really know enough about how he did have the money to buy, to make a house like Liberty Hall. So we need to know more, I think.
Did he serve during the American Revolution?
It's a good question. And I actually, when I did this talk before, kind of went down that road to try to figure that out. Because some people have said that he was, you know how these things get, that he was Lafayette's aide de camp, but he was not. But I think he was probably a volunteer in the volunteer militia. I don't think he served. He was at William and Mary. He actually, I think, had malaria there, and right when a lot of the students, he said, had turned into soldiers in one of his letters. But I do think he helped in some way. It's just not very well documented. But I think he was a volunteer in the Virginia militia, and so he might have helped in some way in Virginia. And that's why, because Lafayette ends up in Virginia with the siege of Yorktown late in the war. And I think that he might have helped somehow, something. So he aided Lafayette somehow. So I think it got turned around and people thought he was the aide, but I don't think he was.
Are there any other questions or comments that our audience would like to ask? We do have a question about Lafayette in South Carolina, that he may have stayed at Rafe Izard's Elms Plantation in North Charleston.
I think that's right. Yeah, I have that. I said, yeah, he visited the Izard family's Elms Plantation.
Yes.
Does that make?
Probably. I don't know. Somebody else among us may know that. Yeah.
Yeah, it says that I wrote this down, that it's currently part of the Charleston Southern University campus.
Yes. And there's a community in that area too. It's built up now. But the Izard family, of course, was an very old Charleston, original Charleston, family. So
the Izard ruins from the house is still behind.
Okay.
Charleston Southern. I tromped around back there. I'm a CSU alumni.
Okay. And one more question. This refers to the enslaved people on the plantation. If the Stepney's bloodline continues today, have any of the descendants been interviewed? Have you been able to?
Yeah, there's actually Stepneys, and I'm not sure if they're related or not. There are some in Louisville, and we have tried to track that down. We haven't interviewed anyone, but yeah, we would love to do that. And yeah, so we're trying to piece together what happened to the Stepneys after like the family line, but yeah, no, we haven't interviewed anyone yet.
Yeah, I think again in some of the reading I was doing that there was some disagreement between Margaretta and John about whether they actually owned slaves. Did I misread that?
Yeah, well, I think maybe well, they did, of course, but
he admit to me from the north, and he,
well, when Margaretta first comes there's a letter, I think, from 1804 where she says that she doesn't have any slaves.
Okay.
But by 1806, they do.
Okay.
So they were gradual emancipationists, and I mean, he did manumit Hannah and Miles and the children, in his will. And then they had also, I think there was like some of the sons when they turned 25 were manumitted. So I think it was tied in with their Presbyterian faith that, you know, they knew it was wrong. It's just one of those complex things. It's like, well, I don't, you know, why did they have them? They knew it was wrong, but they did. So.
Right. So. Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you to members of the National Society of Colonial Dames of America from the Commonwealth of Kentucky for joining this too. This has been really interesting, really informative, and again, you know, a nice link to those of us in Charleston who were also hosted Lafayette and
Yeah.
share a lot of beautiful architecture, just like Liberty Hall. So.
Well, thank you for having me. It was fun.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was awesome.
Yeah. Should we stay on here or get off of here?
You can depart whenever you're ready. We'll no longer hold you captive.
No, it's okay.
Thank you so much. And thank you for what you and the Kentucky Danes are doing. That's fabulous.
We had about 35 at the
You think it was 25? I just wanted it.
35.
35?
35
Okay.
on the screen.
Yeah.
So thank you again. This is going on my list of places to visit again.
Oh, yeah.